appreciate that everyone here is coming in good spirit and coming because you care about an issue. And this is a topic that has got so much conflict in it, and so many people who are very passionate on both sides. And so I've always respected the Quaker faith for one, honoring dissent, and two, believing that people can come together and speak reasonably about things. And so I have actually also spoken with the Ethical Society and a member there, and really appreciate some of the interfaith work that people are doing, because a lot of the harms that are done also come from certain faith-driven perspectives on morality. And so I think the people who can best address those are actually people coming out of the interfaith movement, and other people who come with, love of God or love of spirituality, but also want to prevent people from being harmed by that, who don't subscribe to the same beliefs. And I've always believed that Quakerism was one of the places where that can happen. So thank you first for having us in this space, and we really appreciate the chance to have this conversation, even though some organizations have dropped out. Also want to thank Maya so much for sharing your personal story. I think, this is what's really absent in a lot of the conversations about trafficking, about sex work, is you're not making it safe for people who are undocumented, who are working in sex work, along a whole spectrum of coercion to circumstantial need, poverty, to some idea of free will, whatever that may be, constrained by all the circumstances we all face under capitalism, under our society, where people are coming in from different countries and coming from different levels of economic development, and that there's just class differences that people have to face and navigate through work. I want to come and address specifically about the panic around flushing sex trafficking, and the fact that this is called, this forum, this panel is called Ending Slavery. Right now, if you've been paying attention to the case that's been ongoing in Florida, there's been, this 8-month-long investigation cracking down on Chinese massage parlors in Florida and Jackson and several other cities there. And many women have been rounded up and are currently still kept in safe housing, even though there is no legal reason for which they should be housed. They shouldn't be in prison, but they're basically being detained without access to cell phones right now. And after all of this investigation, there is actually 0 charges, 0 convictions of human trafficking. And so the police had gone into these spaces with a false pretense or premise that they're going to look for trafficking, and instead they rounded up all of these people, put a lot of people in the public light, and after all of this cannot even prove that there's any trafficking that exists. This is a violation of habeas corpus. This is a violation of basic privacy rights. So they've escalated to using, surveillance cameras to record all of these customers, even though they didn't even do the basic tactic of talking to a worker or talking to a formal worker. And these are basic things that you would think you would do if you had any respect for the human dignity or the intelligence of the people who are working inside. And this was clearly not a consideration. And you see this happening over and over and over again. The Florida case is particularly salient on our minds right now because of Robert Kraft, because this very, wealthy, famous Patriots owner, celebrity is caught up in this. But this is happening all the time. People are getting rounded up. There's actually no ability to convict people in most of these cases. If you look at the numbers across the U.S. since 2011, most of these cases end up exactly like this. And as a result, people are deported. Their lives are ruined. They're detained without any legal right. And so we need to think about what are the things that we believe in around trafficking, who has fed us this information, and is this actually harmful to the people that we want to protect? I usually am very wary of speaking about personal matters, because I try to keep things about policy, and I come from a policy background and a labor organizing, so I try to make it not about myself. But I do want to acknowledge, that it is incredibly important to speak also from a sex worker lens, and that there's a space for both, and I'm trying to juggle that because I've been in spaces where that has been used against me. As somebody who's worked previously in these massage parlors, and somebody who is currently organizing with workers in these massage parlors, I can tell you that labor exploitation, the way that you're, sex exploitation, the way that you're imagining it in terms of people being, unable to leave, people being, forced to take on customers all day and not being paid, this is not the situation going on in these massage parlors across the country. Most of the time, people are in these spaces working these long hours because customers call at random times of the night to see them, and they don't want to miss a customer. They're living there because their work may be temporary. They may move from one place to another place because new girls often get paid more, or they get into conflicts with the boss. People are very mobile, but that has nothing usually to do with, whether or not they're being, forcibly kept there. A lot of times, most of the time, people are choosing to live in the massage parlors because they don't want to pay for rent elsewhere if they're going to be working a lot of nights and a lot of days. And so it just makes more sense, given their incomes, to just stay there and be close to in case a customer comes in. And so a lot of the signs of trafficking that are used in these cases by the police in Jackson, by the DHS and their campaigns around how to spot signs of trafficking, these are actually wrong when it comes specifically to Chinese massage work, and yet Chinese people are being targeted for these arrests, right? And so this is a result of not really consulting with people in the business, not really talking to sex workers, not really understanding where they're coming from. I want to bring this back to this conversation about ending slavery, because I think, I want to address that topic, and I want to, that's what everyone's here for. I want to talk about it. I want to talk about the wage slavery that is happening globally in the world, and what are the driving factors of people coming to work in these spaces. If you look at the people who are working in these massage parlors, a lot of them are coming from rural China. In China, there is a system called the hukou registration system, which means that if you're coming from the farmland and you want to work in the city and you don't have a city registration, you are illegal. And yet, due to, since the 1980s, due to the forces of globalization, due to all these prices rising up, it is basically impossible to live in the countryside and survive the way that people used to survive, right? So people need to find work. They send their daughters and sons very young, usually, to work. And they work in these factories, building our iPhones, building, doing garment work. And these are places where already there's all kinds of labor violations. So if you look at some of the electronics factories in Dongguan, which had all these crises of sex workers being rounded up and put into these forcible re-education camps in China, a lot of these women, first of all, have worked already in electronics manufacturing. And in those shops, they have frequently this 2-month wage policy, where they take your first 2 months of work, and that is used against you if you want to, quit, if you might lose the 2 months of wages. If you want to fight against labor or organize, you might lose those 2 months of wages. They make it really hard for you to switch from factory to other factory. And so a lot of people are leaving this exploitative situation looking for a type of work that is less exploitative. And they end up in, often, these massage parlors actually pay just a lot more money than other types of work. And this is a reality we don't talk about. We think about all these massage parlors, it must be all these workers must be paid like nothing. Not really the reality. Massage parlor workers get paid significantly more than domestic workers do, than restaurant workers do, and they're often doing it because they want to pay off their debts or take care of their families as quickly as possible. And they're navigating this gray area that's very difficult with the law, right? So I want to talk about how wage slavery is like a global phenomenon that we all subscribe to with the clothes that we wear, with the electronics that we use, right? We are all paying into it. We are all customers of wage slavery. And these are the driving factors that are bringing people from rural countryland in China into the cities and into Hong Kong, where a lot of these blushing massage workers may pass through, here, and into other places in the United States. And so if we want to talk about the way that people move for work, it is certainly not limited to just the sex industry. It's restaurant workers, it's all these workers. They often, if you look at the massage workers here, most people are also working in other industries. They may work as nannies at the same time as having a night shift. They may be, and that job might feel more exploitative to them than the amount of money they're making in the evenings, right? There's all kinds of issues also with sexual exploitation, for example, in domestic work between the male of the household and the female, the nanny, and that's something that's very silenced because, one, people don't want to talk about it because they might have their immigration tied to their employer, or two, it's shameful, right? It damages relationships. And so when we talk about sexual exploitation, it's not limited just to the sex industry. It's certainly in all of the places that we see cheap labor happening. Why does this cheap labor happen? I want to also walk back, coming from a labor background, I have a very, my theory is tied to ideas of what is the cost of the reproduction of labor, right? And so basically, if you look at the way that like labor rights have been structured, the way we've been fighting for wages and family rates of paying for people in daycare, this is so that the cost of labor can incorporate the reproductive cost of labor, right? I'm using kind of more technical terms. Migration interrupts that. So if you look at what's happening when rural people are moving to the country, to the city, where they get no access to any kind of social services, they can't really conceivably have kids there. They end up having to have kids back, at home. The grandmothers are taking care of those kids. And then the cost of all of that is not being charged in the cost of employing them in the factory, right? This is how employers, this is how the global north saves costs. This is a type of wage slavery that does not incorporate the actual social reproduction cost of that work. It does not take care of the labor of the worker, right? And similarly here, like, why do we get such cheap things? How do we have these Filipino nannies that are leaving their own kids home in the Philippines being taken care of by their grandmothers? So, the woman of the household, for her economic empowerment, which is important, is working a different job, right? So we are all feeding into these exploitative processes in which people, through their work, are not being taken care of as whole human beings. If you look at the customers who are the massage parlor workers' customers, most of them are immigrants. You have these big cases of they always highlight the bankers, they highlight the entrepreneurs, these celebrities. But if you just look at Flushing and look at 40th Road or look around here, who are the main customers of migrant massage workers? It's other migrant workers. And if you want to think about how that ties into how work works and labor works, this is this process that keeps happening over and over and over again, right? Men are coming to this country to do bodily work, for which they can pay for expenses of their families back in their home countries. This system does not allow them to have a family here. It was designed to not allow them to reproduce and have family here. That's why we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, because we didn't want Chinese people to stay. We wanted Chinese to build a railroad, and we wanted them to leave. This is why, in any type of work that includes some element of bodily labor that is gendered, you often also have prostitution side by side, whether that is the army, and soldiers, or whether that is day laborers and railroad workers. These things occur side by side, and these are people whose natural ways of sexually, bodily, emotionally connecting to their partners in that family way has been disconnected due to wage labor, due to the way that we are taking away their families, basically, so that they can work at a cheaper rate for us, right? We are all complicit in that type of slavery. And if you want to talk about ending slavery and why it's really important for us to actually use that phrase if we want to, here, and there's a lot of problems with appropriating that phrase from the slavery, the chattel slavery of African Americans. The problem is that slavery was legalized, right? That was the state complicit in robbing labor, and right now we're talking about criminalized work, right? It's actually quite the opposite. What's causing the exploitation right now of people in the sex industry is not the fact that it is legalized and it's the state, robbing people of labor. Actually, it's the fact that it is criminalized, and so the only people who can protect sex workers are often other people who have been criminalized. Why did we? And I did a lot of activism as a youth in Manhattan's Chinatown. I am aware of yes, there has been this strong culture since the 1900s. Of these strong families, these tongs that have their own police force that basically make sure that NYPD or whatever the police forces aren't the ones entering into these Chinese neighborhoods, but rather they have their own way of dealing with things. And often these gangs start out as benevolent associations. They're families that are helping people mail letters home, that are helping immigrants come in, and they're basically their own law and order in a society that does not want them there, right? And if you look at even now, there's we've heard a lot of these stories of gang warfare in Chinatown, mostly in the 90s, right? And yes, there are still people going to shops, every shop in the door, and be if you guys don't pay us in the beginning of the month, we're not going to protect you in these ways, right? But these happen oftentimes because of communities that are basically outsiders to society, right? And I'm not neglecting, it would be naive of us to believe that there is absolutely no involvement of these kinds of criminal activity in migrant sex work. There is. The extent to which there is much, much, much lower than we're led to believe, because most people are actually coming in and willingly working in other operations created by, former massage partners. But I'm sure there is some element of that, right? But the reliance on that element is due to criminalization. It's our laws, it's our criminalizing this type of labor that is creating that type of reliance on criminal organizations. When we exclude people from society, when we exclude them from the law, that's what causes the growth of gangs, the growth of extra legal ways of enforcing exchanges and power, right, and money more than anything else. Smuggling organizations as well, yes. And so right now it is these laws on trafficking that's causing trafficking, right? It's the laws that's criminalizing prostitution that's causing trafficking. Just take the comparison to the prohibition with alcohol. There was such a rise of gangs right after the Prohibition Act passed. All of these speakeasies, all of these mob bosses that grew out of it. It was a great way for gangs to profit. Like, criminals actually do really well when those laws are barring certain types of products being sold, right? Because that's where they profit, that's where they grow, that's where they get the money, right? When you criminalize people, when you criminalize sex workers, that is extremely dangerous because you are literally putting sex workers into the hands of organized crime, right? And so if you want to tackle trafficking, you have to decriminalize sex work because you're literally treating people like they're drugs, like they're products, like they're not human beings, right? And that's what's causing the dangerousness of this trade when it intersects with organized crime. And so I want to bring this one more time into another picture of how we understand wage slavery, right? Another form of slavery is women's work, I would say, traditionally, right? Traditionally, women were not paid. Traditionally, women had kids, were not allowed outside. Any type of housework that was done was not paid. And so for the longest time, women were not in the workforce. And the only working women, was synonymous with prostitution, right? And so if you look at a lot of the laws that we have around marriage, around what it is, what is appropriate morally for what women should do and what women shouldn't do, they come out of a system in which women were actually forced to work for free all the time, have no rights, cannot vote, cannot own property, right? That's the majority of all of the societies we come from. Women were property. And when women are property, their work was invisibilized, right? And this is a form of wage slavery that in earlier movements around sex worker rights, this was more prominent because now that women do have equal place in the workplace, it no longer becomes about, oh, women want to work, so they do sex work, It becomes these women are, stealing our husbands or something else, right? And so I want us to take into consideration also this sanctimonious structure in which we have our families, where, this is something that is considered sacred because it protects a very important basic unit of our society that has never been equal for women, right? And the changes in that institution is going to have a disruptive factor for different people. I mean, the Bible has, for example, in the Garden of Eden, when Eve takes a bite from that apple, talks to the snake, talks to the devil, that is the most dangerous thing in society. That is the fall of society, right? It's the fall of the garden, because when Eve has access to her sexuality, when Eve has access to knowledge, that's what's really dangerous for the family unit as we know it, the heteronormative, male-dominant family unit, right? And that is what we need to prevent from happening, right? This is so much of our ideas around sexuality, around sexual morality, comes out of a system of control over women's sexuality, right? And we need to acknowledge that in some ways that system of control was also a system of slavery. It was a system of unpaid women's work, care labor, domestic work, childbirth, completely unpaid. And when sex workers are outside of a Garden of Eden that was not created for them, it was created for Adam, maybe it's kind of liberation instead, right? Can we reimagine what that means for people who are not born into this garden that was not made for them? You were made to be somebody just to care for Adam, right? And for Lilith, or for Eve, this is maybe a different way of resisting. And I want to bring that back into the picture of wage slavery and how sex workers actually resist against being forced into factories, forced into more confining, legalistic ways of work, by resisting, by getting paid higher wages in the informal sector. And that is also a form of individual, maybe based liberation, and how sex workers in the early days were rebelling against, against domestic violence, against husbands by working in sex work because their marriage was a site of violence and needed to find work elsewhere. for all of history, sex work has actually been, for many people, a site of liberation and a site of resistance against slavery, right? Against many forms of wage slavery in which people's labor has been taken away from them. And so when we come back to like these times right now, we look at like out of Flushing, we talk about ending slavery here, we need to also understand like in the global picture, what are the driving forces of people working in work that is not the most beneficial for them maybe in a lot of different ways, and the shame around it is the least beneficial of all, right? When we talk to massage parlor workers and ask them what's the most difficult thing about their work, most of the times the answer is not like, oh, the hours, oh, the customers. A lot of times, the most frequent answer is they feel ashamed. They feel like their families will never accept them again. They feel like they're doing something that is against society. This causes this internal hurt that just grows and grows inside of them, and people are very depressed, people are very anxious, people don't know how to reach out to other people, they're isolated. This source of shame is a form of psychological violence that we as a society have imposed on certain people that are just trying to liberate themselves. They're just trying to live a little better, right? And I think from the religious community, from the interfaith community, from the Quaker community, I hope we can tackle that, because this is the source of so much hurt for so many people in our society today, right? Whether it's the LGBTQ movement, whether it's, sex workers, like this sexual morality that came out of the Garden of Eden is a source of pain for people today, right? And how do we come to reconcile that? I also want to pull, before I speak for too long, I also want to pull one more, I'll go into the policies and just bring together a few more things. Like, the anti-trafficking movement is not that new. Sex worker organizing has been going on for centuries. The anti-trafficking movement blossomed in the early 2000s under the Bush administration, during which time a lot of Christian organizations were pulled into government. If you look at the early trafficking bills, they coincided with the passing of the Patriot Act. They coincided with anti-terrorism legislation. If you look at the actual budget, like all of the spending from these bills from the JBTA, which was passed in 2015, to its reappropriation, was repassed this year, most of the money goes into funding law enforcement, funding militarization, and funding policing, right? These are the exact organizations that are making life harder for women working in sex trades and make it so that their work is more underground and more exploitative. And so it's very easy to bankroll government spending on military and government spending on policing when you put it into the package of anti-trafficking. Of course, every congressman is going to vote for that, right? How can you say no to that? If you look at where the money is actually being spent, it's in the JBTA there was a wiretapping provision where it's okay to wiretap, or ICE to wiretap immigrants if there's a suspicion of trafficking of any kind, right? These are violations of our rights being chipped away at little by little under this benign premise that we're helping these trafficking victims, of which we can't seem to give you a straight number or answer about, right? Do you want to talk about it, Maya?
Yeah, I put down and I got some information. The Bush administration spent more than $150 million on efforts to identify and assist victims of trafficking, estimated to be forced annually through modern slavery in the United States. They identified only 1,362 victims between 2000 and 2017. So they spent $150 million within 7 years and only found about 1,000 victims, on top of all the millions of dollars going into nonprofit organizations.
And to the police and to the military, and what are we funding? I think we should think about liberation again, and how sex workers have always pressed for liberation. Actually, right now, when sex workers are fighting against Sesta Pasta, when they're fighting against surveillance technologies, sex workers are again fighting for the liberation of all of us from a fascist police state that we're slowly walking into with surveillance technology, with AI, with everywhere. So again, I think instead of thinking of yourselves saving sex workers, think of how sex workers right now are fighting to save all of us. And what does that type of, panopticon of all surveillance look like in the future if we don't resist that, if we don't question these things that we're told by the Department of Homeland Security about trafficking? What does this world that this is very clearly marching towards actually look like for all of us, right? So I'm going to end here because I've been talking for way too long.